Hiya, my name is Anya and welcome to my brand new channel, Makeup and Metaphors, where we read books and we serve makeup looks. I know, lame, cringe, whatever. So today I want to talk about Charles Dickens, an author that majority of people would heard about but maybe don't know that much about in relation to his life, his upbringing, his childhood, things like that. Especially if you were doing maybe your GCSEs or your junior cert, your leaving cert. Books that are famous, such as A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, which I'm told I sound like when I try and put on a British accent. You've got Great Expectations, just to name a few, you know, David Copperfield. So I hope that you learned something today and that you stick with me. All right, thank you. Hiya, welcome back to my actual face in all of its freckly, red, spotty glory, and hopefully we can see some kind of a transformation happen today in relation to, I'm thinking of a sunset look with like reds and oranges. Maybe we could do a little bit of a cut crease on the front. I'm not going to be going into the products that I use in too much detail because I'm going to obviously be talking about the context of Charles Dickens and his life, but I will leave, you know, what the influencers do this, I will leave all of the things that I'm using down below. I have put everything in kind of chronological order here so that the transition can be as smooth as possible as I go all the way from my primer right up until like my setting spray up until the end. So hopefully I won't be rummaging around too much and it'll be quite smooth. So before I dive straight in, I'm going to just clip my hair back to make sure that nothing gets in my foundation. These clips are awesome because they don't leave a dent in your hair. See, they have like this kind of wide surface area here. I just got them on Amazon. They're super handy for doing your makeup without having, you know, all of the dents in there when you take your headband off or anything like that. So I'll start off with my primer and then let's dive straight into the story. So Dickens was born in Portsmouth on the 7th of February 1812. And this was in Portsmouth, so not in the Medway towns at all. His dad worked in the Naval Pay Office in Portsmouth, and he was only there for a few years before his dad was transferred to Somerset House in London. And again, they were only there for another 2 or 3 years before they were transferred again back to Chatham. And this, I suppose, is when his life in the Medway towns really took effect. He was quite young while he moved from Portsmouth to Somerset House in London and then back down to Chatham. But it was, I suppose, in the Medway towns where he actually began to have an imagination. And, you know, obviously we don't remember our lives when we're very, very young, but he always looked fondly on his time spent in Rochester and like all of the Medway towns and Chatham. So much so that even in his books, when he would refer to like city life was kind of cold and heartless, whereas country life was kind of carefree and happy and a sense of community. And it's almost like deep down that's obviously what he thought of it. He thought of community and towns in the countryside, whereas kind of cold, heartless city life in London and in the cities. So while living in Chatham, himself and his father used to go on lots of walks, and he was actually a prolific walker all of his life. I'm going to go in with some concealer now. He was a prolific walker all of his life. He used to like walk for fun. I'm shaking my head, like lots of people walk for fun. Obviously, I just don't. He was a prolific walker all his life. He used to go on walks in his later years just from London to Rochester, which is a massive distance. And obviously rail travel did exist, so he did it for the actual joy of walking. And him and his dad, while he was quite young, they were walking through HIYA, and they walked past Gad's house. So I'll try and put a picture of Gad's house on the screen now. Well, my fantastic editor will anyway. And he was told by his father, you know, if you work really hard, one day you will be able to afford a house like that. And that really stayed with Dickens throughout his life. And as some of you may know, obviously then later in his life, he went on to purchase Gad's Hill house and lived there, and that's where he spent the majority of his later years. Okay, next I'm going to highlight and contour my face. So one of the most interesting pieces of research that I found based in the Medway towns on Dickens is the profound effect that Rochester Cathedral had on him. So in his early years of writing, he used to find a lot of names for the characters in the graveyards of Rochester. So much so that sometimes if you actually look at the gravestones, you can see some of his main characters' names there. He would never just straight up take a name. He would take maybe the first half of one name and the surname from a second name and kind of meld them together to make names for his own characters. I thought that was quite a good idea. We always, teachers always tell our students, you know, to write a creative piece from your memory, never just make things up. And we can see that in Dickens' stories that he used the streets of Rochester and the streets of different Medway areas and London to actually like forge the destinations, the settings and the characters in his own books, even going and using names from the local cemeteries to come up with ideas on how to name his own characters. So now I'm just contouring, well, cream contouring, just to try and get a little bit of shape into this potato face. And later on, he actually used to look at Rochester Cathedral with a little bit of melancholy because he used to realise, I suppose, how quickly life passes us by. And he used to look at the cathedral and think, like, what a amazing structure that's going to be there for so long. And I'm just like a practical joke, he actually said, because he knew that life goes by so quickly, yet that cathedral would be there and stand tall and be this like structure that would last much longer than his life would. So we can see that like maybe how his outlook changed throughout his life from like quite optimistic to quite bleak in his later years. So that's my base done. I'm just going to go on and do some powder. I'm not going to bother baking my face today because it's quite hot outside and I want to go with the kind of dewy look, I suppose. At age 10 though, unfortunately, his time in Medway was cut short and they had to move once more back up to London. So his father's job was taking them all over the place. He never really got settled anywhere, you know, long term. So they moved up to Camden in London, and Camden back then in the Dickensian era was not the place that it is now. Like nowadays you could think of Camden as pretty much being like a hub of activity, really exciting, almost kind of edgy, but back then Camden was considered like on the outskirts of London, lower class. He actually described his house in Camden, so now I'm just going in with some bronzer just to bronze up my face a bit. I've already done the cream highlighting under my eyes here and the contouring, the darkening around my cheekbones. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of bronzer over them. So he had already described the house in some of his work, so the house in Camden, as being squalid, really, really tiny. There was 7 of them living in that house, 7 children. I think 2 of them passed away, but I'm not sure which house it was in, but there were up to 7 children living in the house in Camden, along with his parents. And it's said that this actually was his inspiration for the Cratchit family house, you know, really kind of damp, not exactly a thriving environment for the children. And unfortunately, this move back to London signified the end of Charles's education, and he really was saddened by that. He thrived in education, he was really creative. Obviously, you can guess that, so I'm going to hydrate myself. You could guess that based on the fact that he's written such amazing stories that at a young age he was showing this promise. His teacher actually noted it down at his school in Kent that he was a very promising student who had great creativity, but unfortunately after the move to London he needed to help his family out, so he needed to step up and basically take responsibility for the checks that were coming in, or the bills that were coming in even. So he got a job. So now I'm just going to highlight my cheekbones. So he got a job in a blackening factory. Now, when we cover this in school, we just simply call it a polish factory, but it technically was called a blackening factory. And he would be in charge of putting the polish on like pots and pans and metal kind of things like that. And he was, I think 10, between the ages of 10 and 12 anyway. He was working from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday to Saturday out in the open. So everyone could see him walking past, and I suppose that was quite humiliating for a boy that was of school age to not be in school and to be working such long hours just to try and, I suppose, help his family. I'm now doing what's called, I suppose, the high points of the face. So my brow bone up here, my cheekbone here, my cupid's bow here, just on your lips. See this shine here? Just the very, very tip of my nose, and sometimes I'll do the bridge of my nose as well. So while working in this job, he was basically giving all of his money to his parents, trying to help them out. And unfortunately though, his dad ended up in Marshalsea prison, and this is something that a lot of people in the GCSE context talk about. So his father ended up in Marshalsea prison for debt of £40, which nowadays doesn't sound like an awful lot, and definitely doesn't sound like something that would end you up in prison, but it was a lot back then, and the debt collectors were after him. So now I'm going to do my eyebrows because they look ridiculous and are not the same colour as my hair at all. So he ended up in Marshalsea prison for a debt of £40, and the way that the prison system worked then was that he wasn't allowed out of prison until his debt was paid, but he wasn't able to work because he was in prison. So quite an odd cycle of, you know, not being able to get out of prison. But while this was happening, his family, so John and Elizabeth and their children, moved into the prison with them, which was really not uncommon at the time. Like, when you think about it, the breadwinner of the family was in prison and the family needed somewhere to stay, so they actually moved into the debtor's prison with them. And the debtor's prison would have had horrible conditions because obviously they wanted to discourage people from going there. So I suppose luckily, but also quite sadly, John's mother died. She passed away and she left an inheritance in which John was able to use to get himself out of prison, but that did not break the cycle of debt. I suppose he didn't really learn anything, did he? Because he just kind of, his mum died and he was able to put that inheritance directly towards getting out of prison. And the cycle of debt continued, you know. I read in some places that it was due to gambling as well. Probably not the best thing to gamble with such a large family, but you know, who am I to judge? It's so hard to do eyebrows and talk at the same time. Basically, I suppose his habits moved with them, and he ended up always being in debt, and they would get evicted. They would move from one house to the next house, the next house, the next house, getting evicted, just moving like down the street to the next street, back to the street that he was on before. And this cycle just continued. And I suppose that stability, it would have been so hard. Imagine, he started off in Portsmouth, then he went to Somerset in London, or Somerset House in London, then he went to Chatham, now he's back in London, and then he's going from house to house to house to house in London. So when John finally got out of prison and they had moved around a few times, this signalled the fact that finally Charles could go back to school, which thankfully ended up changing his life. He knew that education was the way out of this life of labour. He had done this blackening factory to help pay off his family. It would have been hardly any money whatsoever, and he knew that the only way to not live a life of that kind of cycle of small money in, all money out, you know, pay all the bills, was to earn more money, to be educated and get a better paying job. So he finished his formal education, but then he went on and actually began self-education. I'm going to start my eyeshadow now. So I'm going to go for a kind of a sunset look. I'm going to go with red, orange, and probably some yellows. I'm going to start off with the most intense colour, which is usually not something that people do, but it's a really awesome method because you start off with the really heavy colour and then you can blend it out. Most people start off with like a transition colour, but it's not really the best way to do it anymore. So there you go, a snippet of information. So sorry, after he finished his like formal education, he went on and actually got like a reading ticket for the history museum where he would go on and teach himself more, and he would read and continue learning on his own, which I suppose just goes to show how interested he was in developing his own knowledge. Now I still have a little bit of concealer on my eyelid which will help this stick. I should have put an eyelid primer on, but I was too busy talking about Dickens, but anyway, we'll make it work. And I'm back. For some reason my recording decided to stop, so I'll just quickly talk you through the look that I continued doing and talking to the camera like an absolute lunatic while I did it. So all I did was I packed on red here. I'll just redo it a tiny bit so you can see. I packed on red just in here at the crease on both sides, and then I just brought that under the eye very slightly. And then when I had done that, I got my orange on this exact same brush because it'll all just go together, and I just did that just slightly around the peripheral there. It's gonna look super intense, but it's makeup at the end of the day. It's art. Why not have a play with it, especially now that we're all in quarantine and we're not going anywhere. The reason why I suppose I have such a passion for makeup is because I lived in rural Ireland for like my upbringing, and this is something that I would do a lot. I would just put on makeup, take it off, put on makeup, take it off. You know, there wasn't social media when I was young, and we didn't have like loads of channels on the television or anything, so this was just something that I really enjoyed doing. So one way now, so this is looking quite intense, almost like I'm a really bad superhero or I've been in a fight. So one of the best and easiest things to do then is to just get a clean eyeshadow brush, so one that has nothing on it whatsoever, and just like blend this around the edges, and that'll take off the excess and make it look like you were some kind of blending god, that all of this is just perfectly gone in there. And when you blend, you want to blend up like that to make sure that you're looking lifted. Like the last thing you want to do is for your makeup to make your eyes look like they're like sagging downwards. That's pretty much the last thing. Well, unless you're into that, you know, fair play. But it's not particularly what I'm interested in. So skipping on a little bit now into when Charles had released some of his books, he used to do public readings, which is really lovely. He used to charge admission really low so that everyone can go. Like he had gotten some fame. He had moved to, I think, Regent's Park in London, which was obviously a very expensive, lovely area. So he has seen kind of what it's like to be lower class, and he's seen what it's like to be kind of in the more luxury parts of society. Sorry, I'm just looking for my concealer brush. Obviously not as prepared as I thought. Here we go. I'm going to do a half cut crease now, which some people are really intimidated by, but you shouldn't be because it's actually not that hard at all. So I'll just talk to you really briefly about Dickens while I try to do this, so wish me luck. And these readings used to be absolutely sold out. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people would go to them, and people used to say that it was almost like he was possessed, because he like all of the characters had such deep meaning to him, and he used to be so dramatic. And because the admission was, I think there was different tiers, kind of similar to maybe Shakespeare's Globe, you know, that there was different kind of levels of tickets that you could get in and see, just to make sure that every single walk and class of life were actually able to get in there and see him. Oh, this is difficult. I'm struggling to do this while I talk. But yeah, people used to say that he was almost like embodied his characters, and maybe that's because, you know, just like his setting and he took the names from the people of Rochester, you know, maybe he had a deeper connection with the characters than we know. Maybe they represented different people that he had met in his life. So all I'm doing here is I'm just drawing almost like a little circle, and I'm just taking my time just along the inner rim of my eye. And a little cheat to do this is actually to pop a little blob of concealer here on your eyelid, and then just look up like that. Very creepy, I know. Look up like that, and then close your eye and see there, it's already kind of outlined for you, and you can just neaten it up. Just another little tip from the School of Anya, and I just learned that from hours and hours of watching YouTubers do their makeup. So another really interesting thing that I found about Dickens was that when he bought Gad's Hill House, he bought it for, and I wrote this down, so let me check. He bought it for £1,790. You know, quite low by today's standards of the housing market. I would love to get a house like that for that amount of money. Maybe then I could actually get on the property ladder. But just goes to show, I suppose, like inflation over time. So now I've got my cut crease done here. I'm just neatening that up slightly. You want a good, very clear line in order to achieve a cut crease. And the reason why we're doing this is we're going to put a different color eyeshadow onto what we've just done there, and it really makes your eyes pop. And the reason why we go above the actual eyelid is because you want to see the eyeshadow when you're looking straight ahead. If you just do it to where the eyelid stops, then you're not going to see the color at all. And then you just blend it out. A really easy way to just blend it out is to just tap it with your finger there. Okay, so all I've done so far is I've just packed yellow onto where that concealer kind of cut crease, half cut crease was. I've just really popped it on so that it would make it like show significantly. And now all I'm going to do is get a little bit of highlight and just pop it into the inner rooms of my eyes here, just to give it that kind of pop. So when Dickens was 53 years old, he was going on a train to Staplehurst with his friends, and he was in the first class cabin. I better get my eyeliner ready. This is going to be probably even harder than the cut crease was to do. But he was going either to or from Staplehurst. My mind, it just evades me right now. But he was in the first class cabin and he was in the last one. And he, and I suppose nobody on the train, knew that a part of the train line was missing. And they were hurtling forwards 50 miles an hour, not knowing that they were going towards an area of track where there wasn't any track, where there was roadworks happening. So just another little tidbit about makeup is if you do liquid liner, it's always better to start in the middle of your eye and work your way out. And then when you do a wing, make sure that you're either going straight out or up. Again, everything just to be lifted. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So he was on this first class train carriage, the last one. So there was some first class carriages ahead of him, and then there was his right before the beginning of the second class carriages. And he had his latest manuscript on the seat beside him, and then there was two friends that were traveling with him. And as I suppose there was a person who was kind of on lookout for the people who were doing the works, but he was only standing 500 feet from the works, and that is just not enough time for the train to brake and stop completely before coming to a complete stop and making sure that everyone is actually safe. So even though the man, the lookout, saw the train coming and signaled for the train to stop, and even though the train did brake, obviously it wasn't in time, and the train toppled off the track and down into the river below. All carriages, that is, except the first class carriage that Dickens was on. So if you thought that this was going to be how Dickens died, it was all a clever ruse. This is not how Dickens died at all. So the first class carriage was there teetering on the edge of the my lovely yellow hand from the eyeshadow. It was there teetering on the edge of the track. And the only reason that it was there was that it was being held down by the weight of the second class carriage that was still on the track behind him. And Dickens got out, and it was noted how helpful he was. He was giving rum to people that were injured. He was saying prayers with them, like their last write the last word. And he saw some really horrific injuries that day. And it was said that, you know, this trauma stayed with him for the rest of his life, and he avoided rail travel. So I've just finished off my eyeliner there, just off camera, because that was nerve-wracking. That, you know, if you've ever done liquid eyeliner with people watching you, you know, I'm waiting for the judgment about how they're uneven or about how they're too big. But it's believed that this obviously really traumatic experience for Dickens affected him for the rest of his life, and he never really went on any trains unless he really, really had to. Right up until he died, because obviously this would have been an extremely traumatic event. So I'm just popping on some mascara now. I'm going to pop lashes on after that, and then the look will basically be done, and I'll set it and do my lips. So Dickens' health was declining, and he ended up doing one more tour of America, even though his doctor basically told him not to and warned him against it, and it really made his health go into decline even more. You know, he was suffering from like rheumatism on his left side, and he had all sorts of different issues, and apparently an underlying health issue as well that he was just completely ignoring. But then in 1870, he died of a brain hemorrhage. And one, I suppose, really interesting fact about that is that he died exactly 5 years from the day of the train crash. So I'm just gonna put on some lashes and then I'll be right back. So all I did there was pop on some Demi wispy lashes with just making sure that the very inside of them is pressed down firmly and the out of them is kind of pushed up like that, just to make sure again that we're going for that kind of upward slant. The last thing I'm going to talk about, just while I pop on some lip liner and maybe a little bit of gloss, is Dickens' death in 1870, and it made me a little bit sad that his last wishes weren't actually honoured. So Dickens had requested that in the event of his death that he had kind of a really low-key funeral and that he would be buried, I suppose, in Rochester, but this actually basically got overruled, which I think is, you know, rude if it's your last will and testament to be buried in a certain area, and it was decided that he was to be buried in Westminster Abbey. And one part of it was upheld though, and that was that the funeral wasn't, as he kind of said, a lot of faff. It was just a plain funeral. Not many people knew that it was happening, and that was it. And he was buried in Westminster Abbey instead. So this is basically the look. And I hope that you learned something about Dickens. Maybe you learned something about makeup. I'll fix that eyelash, even though it's probably about to come straight off now. I hope that you learned something in general. This is just something I'm really passionate about context, really passionate about makeup and the confidence that it gives people. And it would be great if you want some suggestions, pop them down below. I'm thinking about doing like Robert Louis Stevenson next week. So, you know, give me a like, give me a subscribe, and hopefully you learned something. Thank you.